Happy Christmas! Almost. It's Book Quote Wednesday and the word is easy. Today I'm reading from my young adult fantasy, The Comeback of the King, which is the only one of my novels that actually takes Christmas into account. In fact, it's the last weekend before Christmas and most of the population of Salisbury is enthralled to the mysterious, almost godlike king. My teen hero Ted has come into godlike powers of his own on a temporary basis, and the first thing he must do is prevent a mass human sacrifice to the king around the war memorial in Salisbury's marketplace. Chapter 19. The knowledge fizzed and popped inside Ted's head, and he made a mental note to feel uneasy about that when he had the time. He remembered the thief's awe, "I can see everything," as the original knowledge took hold in his mind, and he had no desire to follow that madman down the same track. But for the time being it was good because it was useful. The easy bit was freeing the prisoners. Ted and the knowledge swept a glance over them. Some were restrained with steel handcuffs, some were tied up with more improvised restraints like torn clothing. The cuffs, he could see the bonds within the metal, the forces that held the atoms together, and it was a simple thing to reduce them to the strength of damp cardboard so that they could just be torn off. Once the people in cuffs were free, they could untie the others. Meanwhile, Ted set up a difference in the air pressure around the memorial so that a strong breeze blew up and carried extra oxygen into the prisoners' lungs. Ted had had experience of smoke inhalation, and he wouldn't wish it on his worst enemy. Then he set his eyes on the king and queen and walked forward. The knowledge continued to nudge the crowd aside, a slight imbalance in their inner ears making them feel they were on a slight slope and needed to take a step backwards to compensate, barely realizing. Then Ted became aware that in all the background noise there were people saying his name. "Ted? Ted? What are you? Hi, Ted." Ted winced. Did his mum and Rob's have to be in the front row? "Not no, Mum," he muttered. And then he did a double take as he came up to the memorial. Was that Barry, slowly picking himself up? "Break the boy's neck." That last bit came from the Queen, not the King, full of malice and authority. Back to the point, the knowledge reminded him. He looked round and stopped dead in his tracks. A man built like a pile of bricks wrapped in a leather jacket strode purposefully towards him in obedience to the Queen. "Fuck, he's massive," he wailed. Time to test the theory, isn't it? The man's face was stamped with a smirk which slowly turned into a frown as Ted held his ground. His ape mind must have registered something was wrong if a weedy 10.5-stone teenager was standing up to him, although he didn't know what, and apparently it wasn't going to stop him. He reached out for Ted, and Ted had no doubt he would do exactly as the Queen had ordered, probably after causing a lot of unnecessary pain first. The knowledge could already have stopped the man in many ways. It could have turned the ground beneath his feet to ice. It could have pinched the blood vessels feeding his brain shut. But all those would have been short-term solutions, and Ted had to know that he was right. His name is Gordon. "You're Gordon," Ted gasped. In the background the king bellowed, a sound of rage and pain like something had been torn from him. The man stopped dead in his tracks, dazed and blinking as if Ted had just thrown a load of cold water in his face and then hit him over the head with the empty bucket. "What did you do?" the king screamed. "I defined him." Ted couldn't help it. He grinned. All of Salisbury, all of the kingdom, was the operating system, fed by the power within the land. The king was as much a part of it as anyone else. The land was the kernel, and the king was the first utility to be installed. It had control over all the other files, all the people who belonged to the kingdom. But by defining those files with functions, with identities, Ted took them from out of the king's control. Ted had done more than just affirm Gordon's name. The knowledge had lifted out of the man's mind everything that had made his character, every influence from his genes and his upbringing and the life he had lived until now. Ted had combined that all into the object that he labelled Gordon and used it to define the man who stood in front of him, once just the king's royal subject, now an individual in his own right. "What did you do?" Gordon gasped, echoing his former master. "Long story." Ted could barely speak for the beam that was taking up his entire mouth. If the kingdom was the operating system, then the knowledge was Tedlish, and not many software developers got that kind of validation. But you don't have to work for the king anymore. Oh, right. Gordon frowned into the distance and shook his head to clear it again, and then looked down at Ted. His mouth slowly twisted in a grin of his own. Only, he said, I like working for the king. The blow came so hard it didn't even hurt at first. Ted was only vaguely aware that something had happened, a jolt like 1,000,000 volts, like an intercity train, like a small nuclear explosion in the guts. He was lying on the damp, cold stone. His lungs were paralyzed. And then it started to hurt. He tried to draw in some breath in a silent scream. A pair of booted feet were in front of him, one aimed right at his head and drawing back, and he couldn't move. But 2 more boots suddenly landed in front of his eyes, polished and police regulation, and then the 4 boots were scuffling around him. The owners were well matched. Gordon was bigger and stronger. Inspector Stewart had the training. Do something, Ted gasped inside himself. I am doing something. You have a rupture of spleen and a tear in your diaphragm. Give me another few seconds. The pain was giving way to a warm glow below his ribs, but Ted still couldn't quite move, and he winced as the grappling boots came near his face. From down on the ground, Inspector Stewart and Gordon loomed above him like giants dancing a drunken jig. The inspector had a can of pepper spray in one hand, but a grinning Gordon was slowly twisting it towards her own face. Okay, this has gone far enough. Ted heard a distinct snap like a bunch of sticks being broken together. Gordon screamed and crumpled. He hit the ground and thrashed like a dying, howling fish, clutching at his ankles, curled up into a fetal ball. The inspector still stood, caught out, not quite sure what had happened. Ted clambered to his feet. I've broken his ankle bones for you, and you're all better. Now finish this. From left to right. Andy, Gary, Brian, Ivor, Ambrose, really? Blimey, Ian, Mick. Like he was machine-gunning the king's circle of guards, Ted recited the names of Gordon's coterie as quickly as he could, all in one breath before the king could stop him. And like a machine gun, each name seemed to thud into the king like a bullet, weakening him, hurting him. Get him, Ted gasped, and the inspector lunged at the king while the knowledge turned its attention to the crowd. John, Shirley, Jenny, Steve, Neil, John again, Jim, Mark, Rob, Russell, Nathan, Rachel, Sue, Becky, Edward, Heather, hi Mum, Robert. The inspector moved too quickly for the king. In one practice move, his arms were pinioned, cuffs slapped onto his wrists, and she was frog-marching him towards the car. Protect your king, he bellowed. Protect your king! But the rows of people nearest him were suddenly moaning, gasping in wonder, staring at each other as if seeing clearly for the first time as the knowledge struck. Further away, the crowd was still royal subjects, though the number was falling by the second, but they were kept from their king by an expanding barrier of people who were suddenly back to normal again and wondering what the hell they had been doing. Their sheer inertia protected the inspector as she wrestled with the cause of it all. The Queen's screech scraped at Ted's soul like breaking glass. Husband! She threw off her coat, and Ted had just a moment to savour the sight of a gorgeous naked woman before her form dissolved in front of his eyes and a ball of water flung itself at the inspector. The aim was obvious. Cover her head, block her mouth and nose, let her drown. With barely a thought, Ted stripped the energy from the water molecules so that they crystallized into ice that smashed to the ground and shattered into fragments. Immediately, like in a movie, the fragments began to run back together again, and the Queen's head and torso emerged from the ground. She glared hatred at Ted, and suddenly he was skewered by a spear of coal so harsh that it burned. Trying to freeze you from inside. The knowledge took over before Ted could do anything. A simple flip threw the spell back at her, turning it around so that it did quite the opposite of freezing. The Queen vanished into a cloud of steam, so violently that the paving cracked, and Ted flinched as the blast washed against his face. He stared in horror at the small hole where she had been. You killed her! She's a spirit that manifests itself in water. She'll be back. Help the inspector. The king was half in, half out of the car, braced with strong arms against the side of the door, almost comical, like a small child announcing, "Shan't!" The inspector was based against him as she tried to push him in, without backup or support, when suddenly she slumped and let go. Ted couldn't see what had changed. The king shrugged her off, and she made no attempt to hold on to him, rather leaning against the car, eyes squeezed shut, teeth clamped together. The king began to climb out of the car again, and Ted yelled and flung himself at the man in a way he hadn't done since getting into a fight in year 6. No strategy, no skill, just a desire to use as much force as possible. He all but bounced off, which he would have done even if the king had just been a normal man. "Oh no, your majesty, you're going down." They came one from either side, catching the king unawares. Two large, burly men, their anger untempered by any form of mercy or compassion. Ian? Gary? Two of that lot anyway, the king's former guards, Gordon's former lieutenants. Ted just had a glimpse of the king's mask of surprise before he was forced into the back of the car and the door was slammed shut in his face. "Blimey, what's wrong with her?" Gary looked at the inspector with interest. Her fists were balled together at her temples, and her whole body was hunched as she muttered, "No, no, no." The knowledge diagnosed the problem. The king dug deep into her memories. She's remembering everything she ever did that she was ashamed of. What, like snogging me? I don't think she's got that far yet. In fact, I don't think she's got past her own teens. The inspector was muttering through her teeth. "I'm not a bad girl. I'm not." "You're a good cop," Ted said loudly. "Well done. That's what I was going to tell you to say." "Yeah, well..." The inspector's eyes flew open, and for a moment her features were composed in peace, as if she had just received enlightenment. But then her eyes narrowed and her face hardened. "Damn right." She registered that the king was in the car and that the two men hovering nearby had something to do with it. "Thank you." She looked around at the crowd. "Coming, Ted?" Ted became aware that the crowd was still there, restless, dangerous. Many had been converted, most had not, though the work still went on. The knowledge had implanted suggestions in the people it touched that they should talk to the people they knew and continue the good work. But it was a dangerous place to be. The outskirts of the crowd were still the king's followers, and many of the inner circle were actively angry and looking for something to vent it on. The plan was 90% complete, but there was still the final stage to go through. Ted swallowed. Yeah. He heard his mother calling, "Ted, sweetheart," and deliberately pretended he couldn't hear as he got into the police car's passenger side. The inspector gripped the wheel with both hands and looked at the crowd ahead. "A little help?" "No problem." The knowledge wasn't as gentle this time, and the crowd ahead of the car cleared like the Red Sea. With a surge of acceleration and a whoop of the siren, the car leapt into the gap. Remember, you can buy my books at www.benjeeps.com. Probably too late for Christmas delivery, but there'll be birthdays next year. See you next time. Bye for now.